The incarceration. Oh, sorry, Jill. I need retraining. I've lost my brain this week. The call to order the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force Steering Committee for November 4th, 2021. It's 11 a.m. and we are meeting virtually. Before we begin, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. The first order of business is a recommendation for amendments to state legislation or police reform. And I see this says it's tentative, Jill. What was it pending that status on?
Yeah, Eric Ritchie asked to be on the steering committee agenda for this at Legal and Justice, but I haven't heard from him. So I put it on hoping he would pop in today. We'll see if he does, but he might not show up for that.
Okay, so for the time being, we'll just skip over it if that's okay with everyone, and we'll move to the next item, which is the behavioral health provider ride-along with law enforcement. This is a recommendation from Behavioral Health Committee to the full task force. It says here the Behavioral Health Committee co-chairs and Under Sheriff Chadwick will be presenting. So I'll let you all take it away.
Doug, I think if you would do the honors, I think just for context really quick, as one of the co-chairs, I see my other co-chair isn't here today. Under Sheriff Chadwick was able to deliver that presentation to the Behavioral Health Subcommittee about a ride-along program. And I think Sheriff Chadwick is going to talk about not just like ride along, like see what the officers do program. It's more like behavioral health providers riding along. And we wanted that, what he saw and he observed in those programs to have the health department who's working on alternative response. We wanted him to have that model, not necessarily the name or the brand name, but the methodology and how it might be useful as like a multi-pronged approach, urban versus rural. And with that, I'll stop and just mention that we were really impressed on the subcommittee, and we're already passed that along to the health department. So with that, Doug, I'll shut up and let the knowledgeable person go.
Before we start, Dan Hamill just texted me. He's having trouble getting in. Jill, I don't know if there's something you can do.
I've just emailed him an alternate link, but that's about all I can do for him. So
okay, then you've heard from him. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Doug.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike, for the intro, and I think everybody knows me. Seems like we're on multiple committees and meetings. So again, Doug Chadwick, Under Sheriff Hare at the Sheriff's Office. And this is a program. It's I've been in these meetings talking about law enforcement and behavioral health for about 4 years now. And I think we're very fortunate here in Whatcom County that we were ahead of the curve with some of this legislation that was passed here in the last legislative session. But with that said, there's still a lot of work to be done and still a lot of resources that need to be stood up to make sure that we have the capacity to provide the services that are needed. But this is a co-responder program that's currently being run in Skagit County with the Skagit County Sheriff's Office and Compass Health. They refer to it as the Impact Program. And basically they're integrating crisis response teams with law enforcement, which is something that I've advocated here in Whatcom County that I think is a good model for rural portions of Whatcom County, just because of the time delay in response if a mental health provider is out in the field by themselves, or if law enforcement arrives on scene to a call with somebody in mental health crisis. And once they've determined that the scene's safe, they make that call to, currently MCOT is probably the biggest resource we utilize, which is a Compass Health program. That's the mobile crisis outreach team. And they would either send somebody out to respond to the field, or depending on their resource availability, they may have to follow up with a phone call or a in-person a day or two later. So as we know, a lot of times it's important when people are in crisis to provide those resources now, and ideally where they reside, rather than trying to take them somewhere else and provide those services. So if we can provide services where they're most comfortable, in their home or somewhere else, I think that's the ideal situation. So the idea with this co-responder model is to have behavioral health clinicians riding with law enforcement, so that when they arrive on scene, they can do their initial assessment, determine scene safety, and then if appropriate, that behavioral health clinician can then step forward and start working with the individual to try and get them, it may be a case of de-escalation. It may be a case of, once things get calmed, that they can start talking about resources that would be beneficial to them. And again, this is just one program. I know we've been having a lot of discussions about an unarmed response to these type of crisis calls. And I think that has merit as well. But I think you have to have, one program doesn't work for everybody. So if you've got multiple variations of that, again, the unarmed response is still a co-responder model. But what we've been discussing here in Bellingham specifically is having a community paramedic partnered with a behavioral health clinician. So you don't have law enforcement involved, but the advantage they have in Bellingham is if that situation suddenly escalates and becomes more of a safety concern, they can call Bellingham, and their response time is going to be a lot quicker than if that situation occurred in Glacier or somewhere a little more remote, where the law enforcement response is going to be delayed just because of the geography and how long it takes to get there. But the other thing could be, depending on the sheriff's office, if I've got a sergeant and 4 deputies in the field, and 2 of them are on a domestic and somebody else is dealing with a rollover crash, that doesn't leave me a lot of resources to cover the rest of the county. So that could create a delay as well. So from the, from a safety perspective, I think it addresses that. And I know we've heard with the changes in the legislation, where law enforcement, one of the alternative under the duty of reasonable care is, once they've determined that a crime hasn't been committed or that there's no imminent threats to the persons on scene, one of the alternatives is to leave the scene. That unfortunately leaves some of our medical personnel and potentially our behavioral health specialists without that sense of safety and security if law enforcement is not on scene, or if they leave and then things do change. Because a lot of times, especially with people in mental health crisis, they can go from calm to escalate it very quickly, and that becomes dangerous for not just the family members or the first responders on scene, but also for the person in crisis. So we want to make sure that we can address that. And I think this serves both purposes. It provides immediate response from behavioral health specialists that are on scene, rather than having to call and have that delayed response, which could be 30 minutes. It could be 2 days before that response happens. And also addresses the safety concern from the mental health community about being on these type of calls without somebody there that can step in, that has the tools and the training to, if verbal de-escalation isn't effective, somebody that can step up and has some additional resources that can provide that layer of protection for those persons. So that's really, in the nutshell, the program. In Skagit County right now, they have 2 behavioral health deputies. They have funding for another 2, so they will have 4 designated behavioral health deputies. Currently, the sheriff's office, Whatcom County Sheriff's Office, has 2 designated behavioral health deputies, and they have 7 behavioral health clinicians in Skagit County that will be assigned to that program. So, and one of those actually will be residing, they'll have an office in Concrete, so a little more remote to address some of those remote situations. And that person will actually have their own vehicle. So they can either ride with the deputy, or they can respond to the scene and meet the deputy there, or they can be called to the scene once the scene's rendered safe and respond. But the others will go in and out. But if you read through the Skagit Impact Program, it's really a hybrid of what we're doing here with Grace, addressing high utilizers of 911 services. It's providing that diversion, which we have here in LEAD. And it's also essentially, they've taken MCOT in Skagit County and put them in the car with the deputies. So there's that immediate response. So again, that's just one variation of responses that may work. And I think you need multitudes. It's no different than the programs we have. LEAD doesn't work for everyone, but it works for some people. So having multiple variations of that co-responder response, I think for the sheriff's office in more rural areas, I think that is the safest and most efficient and most effective model. And I know before Ann Deacon left, she was working on some funding specifically to hire and put clinicians in the car with our deputies. And we certainly support that. We think that's a best case scenario for our behavioral health deputies and getting services to people where they are. So with that, I'll stop talking and try and answer any questions that you have.
So Doug, speaking of funding, is this something that that your office has put any request in on our mid-biennium adjustments going forward next year?
We did not. We have obviously we have funding for the 2 behavioral health deputies, and we are continuing that. I was kind of relying on the health department to look into the funding, and I don't know, maybe Perry knows better if that was a grant funded. Obviously the problem with grants is you get it in place and then the funding goes away. So ideally, if it can be funded, it's a sustainable funding source, that's better. But that was right now, we haven't put anything in the budget for clinicians. But I know Skagit County is actually looking at hiring the clinicians as county employees. So they have a little more say in their salary because as Arlene has brought up multiple times, there is a huge workforce issue within the behavioral health community. And some of it, quite frankly, just comes down to what they're being paid. So you see a lot of turnover, and they're trying to address that turnover issue by providing, a reasonable pay scale, benefits, and everything that goes along with that as a county employee.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Questions? Mike.
Thanks for the presentation. I like it ×2, Doug. You're on spot today, and I really appreciate it. I was curious in your discussion of the model and how it might function and its advantages for some of your rural, more far-flung parts of Whatcom County. It didn't mention anything about dispatching. So would you just touch on that real quick? Does how you're kind of envisioning or what you understand about this program, does this have any bearing on dispatch, or are you really kind of viewing this as like, boy, we need every officer out there to be with a behavioral health condition? Could you just touch on that a little bit? Because some of our other models are really looking at like, wow, when the calls come in, how do we dispatch? So could you touch on that just briefly?
Sure. And I know we've discussed this before. I think from a dispatch perspective, it's very hard for a dispatcher to decide what's the best resource to send. And there's always that concern that if I send the wrong one and somebody is hurt, that's certainly. So I think a lot of times they default to the safest option. So I know we've looked at different decision-making trees on how to decide which ones, is a welfare check with no other mitigating circumstances appropriate to send an unarmed response, or do we just not have enough information? Because I've been to welfare checks that have turned into much more in criminal activity and serious crimes. It's basically they're not responding. Can you go check on them? And then you find a body in the house. So, but I think what we envision right now is our behavioral health deputies, if they are working and they see because we have computer aided dispatch in the car, so they can see the calls that are in the queue. And once they're clear, if they see one that has a behavioral health component, they will generally try and prioritize those and say, I'll take that call, and they'll respond. So I see behavioral health clinicians riding with them as supplemental to that. Now they arrive on scene with them already. Now, if they're not needed, now they're in the car. So that's one of the downfalls of having them ride with the deputies is if it's not appropriate for the deputy to be there, now they're kind of stuck there. You don't want to drive away and leave somebody on scene. So I think they're just going to, dispatch will probably direct calls with a behavioral health component to those deputies and ideally those deputies with clinicians, but they could ride with any deputy because all our deputies are trained in crisis intervention, de-escalation. And again, you never know what the circumstances are until you arrive on scene. What you're dispatched to and what you end up responding to oftentimes are two very different things. So since I was started here at the sheriff's office over almost 28 years ago when I was at FTO, I'd said you can't, we get dispatched to a call and it's based on the information that the dispatchers are given. And if that information is incomplete, that's a lot of unknowns. And quite frankly, there's potential safety issues that they don't know until they get there. That's why they need to be very aware when they make that approach and be using their eyes and their ears and doing that assessment. And, we're doing the same thing with fire right now. We're trying to, really retrain them, slow down your approach when you're walking up and really look and listen and try and do the best assessment you can, an eyes-on assessment of what you have and do you have the appropriate resources there, or do you need to call somebody else? So does that answer your question? Hopefully.
Excellent. Yes, very well. Thank you, Doug.
Raylene.
Thank you, Doug. I know we still have a shortage of behavioral health clinicians in the county, statewide, nationwide, all that good stuff. Do we have the same problem with deputies in the county? I know Dan Hamill mentioned getting behavioral health deputies or officers for the Bellingham Police was a little bit of a challenge recently. So are we seeing a shortage too with the county?
Well, right now we only have 2 budgeted behavioral health deputy positions and they're both full. We have people that are very committed to those positions and they're the right people for the job. It takes, these people have very good interpersonal communication skills. They've been doing the job a long time. They have EMT and medical backgrounds. They're negotiators. So they have a lot of training and experience to handle these kind of calls. So, but I know, right now the sheriff's office is the only law enforcement agency in Whatcom County that has a behavioral health officer or deputy program. And I know Bellingham had some, and I believe they had funding for more. And right now, I think there's some hesitation just based on the legislation. And I certainly understand that. And we told our deputies, listen, we understand the concern, but we can still go to these calls. We just need to do an adequate assessment of what is the appropriate resource, and then either or call them there or determine that we can leave the scene. But again, that really comes down to a safety issue.
Perry.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Appreciate the information. I was curious, one piece of information that I'll share is that I do have a meeting scheduled with the BHASO actually this next Monday to talk specifically about funding. Essentially, the ASO at this point are responsible for funding that comes from the state to our region and disbursement of that funding for crisis response and response type issues. So crisis stabilization center, kind of thing, and also crisis response. So it is not, in my understanding, and I'll get more information, but it's not a grant. But it is funding that's allocated towards that. So I'll just make that clarification, and obviously have more information following the meeting that's scheduled on Monday. And I'll touch base with you and others. The question that I had was whether or not your office has had any formal communication or communication in general with Compass Health in regards to impact. I know that we're saying, that it's not necessarily impact as a model, but I was just curious if there was any discussions that had occurred with the sheriff's office at this point and Compass Health by virtue of impact.
No, I haven't talked to him specifically about having Compass Health. Obviously, Compass Health has MCOT here in Whatcom County, and it looks like they took that same program in Skagit County and actually put them in the car. So I know there is, and I don't know all the behind the scenes, but I know there is some changes in philosophy from Compass Health on how they're going to deploy their behavioral health specialists. So I don't know if it seems like, and we're having the same issue in the jail. We contract with Compass Health, and we're losing some of our behavioral health specialists and mental health professionals in the jail as well, which is crucial. So I have not talked to, I mean, obviously I talked to John Dukes, who's oversees MCOT here, but I don't know specifically what their plans are for that program. But it sounds like there's at least some discussions about reworking that model and how that's going to work. And maybe it may very well be looking to do more of what they're doing down in Skagit County with their personnel.
Thanks.
Arlene. You're muted, Arlene.
Sorry. I'm curious about whether anyone knows, or if the initial training programs for deputies and police officers are changing their curriculums to include behavioral health training, essential crisis training. Is that happening?
Well, I mean, even when I went through the academy, they had a whole course on crisis intervention and de-escalation, verbal tactics. The training now has kind of evolved into going through the different mental health disorders and what it looks like when somebody's in, somebody with a substance use disorder, to include somebody that may have autism in the different where they are on the spectrum. So really trying to teach deputies and officers how to identify somebody that's in behavioral health crisis. And again, whether that's somebody that's in a manic episode or somebody that's schizophrenic, maybe just somebody that's having an anxiety attack, whatever it is. So they lay that foundation, and then they talk about how to deal with people and provide deputies with the de-escalation skills to do that. And they actually have a program specifically for corrections deputies as well. And we had Caleb can correct me, but we had all our corrections deputies go through that last year, 2 years ago. Might have been 2 years ago. I think it was before COVID.
Yeah, it was.
And then, like I said, Ann Deacon had brought up Ellis Amder, who is a well-known in the state, and he does an outstanding job of really, he doesn't just talk about it. He actually shows you what it looks like. He's been in the field for a long time, and he would have deputies come up and role play through those scenarios with them. So, and I know that with new recruits, that's part of the curriculum down there now. And then we have ongoing crisis intervention training annually. A lot of that's being pushed out right now online.
So this is very good to hear. I'm really glad to hear about these changes and improvements. And it's those are good steps along the way. But on the other hand, if you can imagine behavioral health trained individuals with masters and licenses of various types, learning about law enforcement behavior in 4 or 5 courses. I mean, there's no comparison to the background and the training of a licensed and degreed therapist. So we still have that issue.
I agree with you. And that's why I would certainly advocate to have them in the car with the deputy, and they're the subject matter experts. So, and I think, and I know I've talked about this in the behavioral health subcommittee, we seem to talk a lot that, we want to take funding from law enforcement and put it into behavioral health. I said, it's not an or, it's an and. We need to have law enforcement, but we need to improve the resources we have for behavioral health. And then they work jointly to address the problem, and the resource that's most appropriate at the time should step forward and use their area expertise. But I agree with you, Arlene. I would much prefer that a licensed and trained behavioral health clinician is the one doing that. Obviously, for probably the last 20 plus years, our deputies have been tasked with doing that. And when families don't know who else to call, they dial 911, and we show up and we try and solve the problem the best we can. But it's usually a short-term solution. And I think we're looking more at what's a long-term solution to these issues.
Do you have any sense, even in a rough way, of the amount of time it's going to take for this the co-responder program to actually go into operation, or does anyone else?
From my perspective, all I need is to have them riding in the car with the deputies, and we've accomplished that. But it's just a matter of getting the resources hired. And again, we're hiring clinicians for LEAD. We're hiring clinicians for the GRACE program and a host of other programs that we have here in Whatcom County. But that's just a variation of it. But I think it wouldn't take a whole lot to get this program up and running. Like I said, I already have the 2 behavioral health deputies, so all I need is those licensed and trained clinicians to be in the car with them, and we can now have a safe and expeditious response to these type of calls.
Thank you.
Dan.
You're muted, Dan.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I've got a cell phone kind of daisy chained to the computer. I'm having some tech issues over here. I just want to point out, and I apologize for being late to this meeting. I couldn't get on earlier, but I did want to point out on October 19th in the Behavioral Health Committee, the chair moved to make the recommendation to the task force to support the development of a program based on the impact program model. The motion was seconded and carried unanimously by the members present at the time of the vote. The motion was subsequently amended to make the recommendation to the steering committee, and I so move.
I'd second that for sure. Discussion? Any other questions or anything? Mike?
The only thing it had brought to my attention, which I think is a good one, and it might have been Doug or it might have been Dean White, who was also present, that in the motion, we don't necessarily have to name a specific branded program. It is really more the content of the program and less the provider or the name. But I am very much in support of this motion.
Perry? Sorry.
Yeah, wanted to also reference that I'm working with Dean, as he had shared, in terms of the development of the art, of our alternative response team, and really looking at a system approach for consistency across the board in terms of our response and our crisis response. And I know that team, that executive committee is developing that. And so I appreciate, Mike, your thoughts too, that it's like not necessarily impact, although, that's certainly an option, but the model itself, I think, is an important concept. And again, I wish that the meeting that I have on Monday were earlier so that I could report in on that, just in terms of funds and some of the other stuff. So I just offer that.
Caleb?
Thank you. I echo what Mike said earlier. I think that it's important to recognize that the concept needs to be the most important thing. I would hate to see something derailed, a good movement, a good process derailed by, we didn't have the right people in place for it to look exactly like we hoped it would. And I would hate to see a good concept go down for that. Just because we've had so much difficulty in the field of behavioral health in terms of having the right people and just having people available in general, as the undersheriff mentioned earlier.
Dan?
I can amend the motion to make it more of a conceptual co-responder model with details to follow as the program gets developed.
And the seconder of that motion agrees with Dan's amendment. Any further discussion on that motion? Okay, see, does anybody have any objections to that motion? We'll do it this way. Okay, I see lots of heads shaking no, so we will proclaim that passes unanimously.
Excuse me, Jill here. Can I just clarify the motion? Is this going forward to the full task force at its next meeting?
That is correct.
Okay. So my question then is for Under Sheriff Chadwick, if you're willing to give this presentation a third time to the full task force, is that what you guys would like me to schedule, a separate agenda item for this?
Unless you're tired of hearing from me, I'd be happy to do it.
Jack,
Yeah, I think we probably have to do it that way. Have the presentation of the whole task force with the understanding there was a unanimous recommendation by the steering committee to approve the motion. I think that would make sense, Stephen. That would be the logical approach, I think. Okay.
Right. Great. Thank you.
okay, anything else on that subject? All right, seeing no more, we will move on to the year-end report to County Council. And Jill, do you have an update for us?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I don't know if you all have had a chance to look at what I sent out to you a couple of days ago. Would you like me to screen share?
Sure, go ahead, please.
Okay, just one moment while I get there. My question for everyone today really is to just let me know if I am going in the right direction in terms of topics that you want me to discuss. Let me pull this up one second. So this is an outline of the topics that I've included in the report. This doesn't include the summary narratives that I sent you. For the updates, the 2021 updates for the full task force and each of the committees, I simply just reviewed what y'all have been talking about for the past 6 months or so and wrote up a little blurb on them. So I think I'm good on them unless there's anything that you see you would like me to change. What I'm looking for today is guidance from the committees on what they want in their what's next in 2022 section. So if we'll start with the full group, with the full task force right up here. There's a number of bulleted items. Is there anything that is missing or should be removed?
Raylene.
Yeah, I think it looks great. I'm questioning, so the legal and justice, we have updates with the legislation, police reform bills, but it's also in the full task force, which belongs there. Are we doing duplicates, or do we want to keep them in both places, or do we think they're two different things?
The narrative that I've written for both sections is a little bit different to reflect what the committee did and then to reflect what happened in full task force. I can take one out if you like, but I know it was a significant item that the committee's been working on this past 6 months. So I felt that it was necessary to include, but I'm happy to take that out if you want me to.
No, please leave it in then. Thank you.
Okay.
Mike.
Yeah, thanks for putting this together, Jill. Regarding the last bullet on next in 2022, I think that is one facet of GARE. Obviously, as Whatcom County has now pursued GARE membership, we might want to expand that. It's going to be our participation, the resources available to us, and I guess to some degree our responsibility is increased with GARE, and I think it will go beyond the toolkit. And also you see in our agenda for today that Stephen Gockley and I attended a Public Health Advisory Board discussion, and part of that discussion was looking at the Whatcom Racial Equity Commission and the creation of that. So I think in terms of thinking ahead for 2022, how do we integrate that work? How do we connect with that work? And then how do we utilize our GARE membership, including the toolkit? So I would just, in the best succinct way possible, maybe expand that a little bit beyond just the toolkit would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Mike, I think you received the email I sent out a couple days ago that included that narrative. Did you get a chance to read that for that section?
No, not entirely, but I will.
I can resend that to you, or you can take a look at it, and then feel free to suggest changes, expansion, any other languages that you'd like on that
Great.
section.
Great. I'll go ahead and do that, Joe. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else on our year-end report?
Got a few more. Legal and justice. Raylene and Arlene, is there anything that you want me to add? I only have the one item right now for what's next in 2022.
I think we should probably continue to touch on the LEAD program. That's something that's ongoing and it's going to be changing as the laws have changed. So I don't think we want to not keep that in there. I also, pretrial services through Superior Court is kind of on hold with the COVID, but I'm hoping that post-COVID, hopefully next year at some point, we can enhance that program.
Thank you. For the Crisis Stabilization Facility Committee, Perry and I talked a little bit yesterday already on this section. I think we're good there, Perry, unless there's anything else you'd like me to add.
I was writing up just a little bit to offer a few more details, Jill, and I will finish that before the end of the week.
Great, that would be fantastic. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Behavioral Health Committee, Dan and Mike, do you have any particular items that you're thinking of for focusing on in 2022? Or if you think of something over the next few days, you can email that to me as well.
Stephen.
Thanks, Barry. Jill, I want to go back to legal and justice for just a second. We tend to lose track of the fact that the pretrial processes work group actually sort of is tucked underneath legal and justice. And so I would, if Raylene and Arlene are okay, for what's next in 2022, I would suggest adding a bullet that says something like monitor implementation of pretrial risk assessment.
Happy to do that. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen.
Dan.
Dan, you're muted. We can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Apologies. I'm trying to do this on a phone and a computer, so it's kind of a
That's okay.
challenging. So I'd like to have behavioral health workforce assessment at some point for next year, and I want to have a heads up on certain types of new substances that are out there. Just as a complete coincidence, on a ride along with the community paramedic, I came across 2 new narcotics that are being heavily used, and I want to understand treatment options for them, and other ones. I just want to have new drugs, as they come on, new street drugs as they come online, to have a heads up from whatever providers can give that information.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Since behavioral health and legal and justice have agreed to have quarterly meetings instead of twice a year, I thought it might be time to have a separate section for those. If that's not a direction you want me to go toward, let me know and I can take that apart. I guessed a little bit on what's next in 2022 for the joint meetings. The ART and reentry are 2 priority items for both committees right now. But if the 4 of you, the chairs, could give me a little direction on where you'd like me to go with this, that would be helpful.
Dan.
Dan, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry about that. Again, can you hear me now?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. I want to have periodic updates on LEAD and GRACE. I think those joint meetings are appropriate because they fall under both auspices. So, and it doesn't have to be every meeting, but I think at least annually on both programs.
Sounds great. I can do that.
Thank you.
Anything else?
I would like to see updates on the crisis triage center and how it's being utilized by both parties, law and justice and behavioral health.
Okay.
Dan?
Hey, Jill, one more. Hey, thanks, Barry. I'm wondering if since it's timely, if we can get updates on ARPA funding recommendations as relates to the work that's being done in both in these committees, but also in the broader task force. There were a number of recommended items that were, I believe the recommendations were adopted. Flaherty put them out and they were, mostly agreed upon. And they touch on all these things that we're talking about. So an update on ARPA.
Okay.
Thank you.
Caleb?
I know I'm not on behavioral health or legal and justice, but I want to mention when it comes to reentry, this is just more of a clarifying statement here. We have a full-time behavioral specialist that is dedicated to reentry here, a position for one at the jail. And that position hasn't been filled for, 6 months. And that is severely impacting our ability to get proper reentry connection between the people who are in custody and the community. And I just want to put that out to you all in terms of your awareness level. This has to be fixed. Like, this is just it's not a good situation on any level, but this continues to be a problem as we move forward into next year without that position being filled.
Raylene, and then Mike.
Thank you. To address your concerns, Caleb, it is on the legal and justice agenda as a topic for our next meeting. Would you be willing to speak a little bit on the problems and anything that you would think would be beneficial to try to get that filled?
Absolutely.
Mike?
Okay, I'll try and be brief. Jill, I know you want to get this report piece out. I just want to chime in very briefly. The street outreach team in the city of Bellingham really relied very heavily on that behavioral health specialist to connect us with individuals who are going to be released. And one of the things that our street outreach team would do, we were one of those organizations that Caleb was talking about. We would try to get people on the list. If they had fallen off the list, we would try to connect to them and talk about what your plans are. We would tell them about maybe new resources that were available. And not having this essentially means that an individual may get released and we might not even know about it. We may find him at a soup kitchen before we meet him. And let me tell you how it used to be before. We would be able to meet with them in the jail. The behavioral health specialist in the jail would connect us with individuals. So I don't want to take a bunch of time. I just want to show you the human side of what Caleb is talking about. And it is this key interface. I can't tell you how key the interface was for our outreach workers to start connecting those individuals. I think we're ready to go. If people hadn't heard, the city council has authorized some funding to expand the reach of the outreach team by a couple of individuals. Thank you to the city of Bellingham. We would love to be able to have access to folks before they're being released to start having some of those conversations about what those next steps are. So I would just like to underscore from the community provider part, and we are lay providers, but we can be kind of a lifeline for folks and can hook them up with a lot of different services upon reentry. So just underscore, exclamation point, and yes, Caleb, thank you.
Arlene? You're muted.
We had at a previous time a charitable organization that had a very organized program for reentry, including classes, supplies, supports, transportation, clothing, training. And this was before the pandemic. And of course, all of that stopped at that point. Can we not re-engage them? I mean, I don't know the answer to this question. I'm just posing it.
Anybody have any thoughts on that? Caleb?
Yeah, to the extent that we're able, we're re-engaging all the services that we had prior to the pandemic, but with obvious limitations. Number one, with being able to keep everybody segregated for quarantine periods, vaccination, all of the things that are pretty obvious with COVID. We've had challenges in that area, but we're interested specifically in getting all of those services tilted up. And I feel very strongly for what Mike was saying earlier. We miss that connection, that human connection, when we don't have somebody whose job it is to look around at our population and make the connections physically between people who are in custody and the services that exist on the outside. I cannot underscore it enough, just as Mike said.
Barry, we're going into issue analysis and problem solving when really Jill's just trying to get the bullet points for the annual report. And if the committees want to provide her some text on reentry needs and where that focus would be, I think that's appropriate to this discussion. But I don't think we need to go into further detail on that particular topic.
Okay, so Jill, does that accomplish
Yes,
everything you wanted to do today?
I'll just finish by saying that Caleb and I have already spoken about index committee. All the feedback that you guys have talked about today is incredibly helpful. So thank you very, very much. Next step for me is to finish up the narratives for these items, and I will be emailing that around to the various chairs, hopefully in the next few weeks. Thank you, everyone.
Yep, Stephen.
Caleb, what would you think about adding a bullet under index to engage with a data consultant to address issues? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Dr. Harris, but we don't need to specify her, obviously.
Yeah, so what I envision that going under is the first bullet point, which is investigate the option of creating a data repository, and sort of that investigative process would be engaging with Dr. Harris to make that happen. So there's space on the report for some narrative underneath there, and that's where I envision that going.
Mike.
Jill, did you have a deadline for comments and feedback from this committee if we're going to send you something in writing outside of it?
I would say submit comments before the next steering committee, probably a week before the next steering committee. So in about 3 weeks.
Great, thanks.
Alrighty then. We'll move over to the Public Health Advisory Board Racial Equity Subcommittee meeting. And I guess this will be Stephen, Mike, and Jill.
Well, I guess I'll start. I don't think there's a lot to say other than the fact that the three of us got invitations from the Public Health Advisory Board, which was the crafter and the proponent of the resolution that both city and county councils, I think, passed designating racism as a public health crisis in the county. I'm assuming also that it had some connection with our GARE membership. It's a little bit unclear to me why it was coming out of the Public Health Advisory Board, but it was an attempt to get representatives of every board and commission within the county to meet, talk about where racial equity was in its many guises on their organizational agendas, activities they were engaged in, goals that they had. And I'm not sure if they saw it as a one-off. I think after the meeting, it seemed pretty apparent that there was both interest and need to continue the conversation in a couple of meetings afterwards. Procedurally, I don't know that it was all that effective because we didn't have much breakout time to actually share information, but it was nice to see faces and hear a little bit about what other boards and commissions were doing. Mike or Jill, anything you want to add would be great.
Yeah, I would just say that I had a different experience from Stephen. I really got a lot from the session. The work session was geared towards all of the boards and commissions, excuse me, that are housed within the health department, so it's not countywide. They weren't working countywide, and I believe the original resolution originated with the health department. So my interpretation of this process was to start implementing what the resolution asked for. I found it very helpful, but I wasn't representing the IPRTF. One of my roles in the county is to help facilitate appointments of all council appointed boards and commission members. So it's a little more global. And I look forward to working with this group in the future to figure out ways to improve our outreach and recruiting. And I will also take what I learned from this group to what I take to the Racial Equity Commission when that launches, right? So a big part of my job, I think, is going to be to engage with the Racial Equity Commission, because a lot of that resolution talks about the county boards and commissions. So yeah, I got a lot out of it. I thought it was great. Thank you.
I'll just add briefly to what Stephen mentioned. So obviously we were there primarily to give kind of status updates about how is your committee or not handling racial equity questions, what kind of work are you in, what barriers are you hitting. One of the things that was interesting was we were sitting with folks who were in the solid waste committee and various different types of committees, right? Child and family well-being, and then here we are with criminal justice work. There were some commonalities, and I think that surprised me. Some of the commonalities and things that I heard were really in the barriers. So I'm wondering if we might get some synergies by this occasional collaboration. And specifically, I'll highlight a few. Data. Boy, did I hear that pain from other people too. And I think getting meaningful data, whether that be participant data, whether that be people showing up at your meetings. So I would say both data and then participation of diverse groups and meetings were pain felt by many committees and commissions. Another thing, and not touched on as heavily as this group has done, but how do we communicate with the public, right? What is happening? And when I got a sense that this is really a larger issue, it's not just that the incarceration task force feels stymied or feels stuck or has barriers. I think that that was kind of shared. So the reason why I bring that to this group is, one, I think we've got some fellows here with some of our challenges, and two, might solutions that are hatched in one, the fact that there's multiple needs across multiple committees, might that help us move the needle where we haven't been before? So specifically when it comes to our communications, that has been an ongoing issue for multiple years. Funding possibly to cover that could be emboldened by the fact that it could serve multiple committees. I think the racial equity work is also key as we all learn and we work with the Equity Commission. What does it look like and how do we implement those changes? And then the third area about representation, and a couple of the subgroups that I was in really shared that pain about like all the efforts and work they have done to increase representation from marginalized groups, maybe from the groups that the committee is doing work on their behalf. So I think the solution set could be something shared, and we might do better in concert. So, you know, if this group, the steering group specifically is interested, if there is ongoing interface, we may want to designate a person or two and not just have it all sit on Jill to join in any discussions that might have benefit for our committee.
Stephen.
Yeah, Jill's and Mike's comments did a great job of fleshing out and reorienting my report. I endorse everything both of them said. And I think part of why I maybe gave a little more lukewarm introduction to it was because I misperceived the point of it. I went in thinking we were talking about our work. You know, I'm working with the judges on the pretrial risk assessment and racial equity in the outcome. Trying to address racial equity in the actual work of the system that we're charged with being immersed in was what I was thinking of, when in fact, most of the people were there and most of the discussion had to do with things like Mike and Jill were both talking about, recruitment for membership on the on the boards and commissions, to have diverse membership and to communicate to subcommunities within the county so that the information about the works of the boards and commissions were going out. So I had a different take going in, and it took me a little while to adjust. And obviously by my report, I still haven't adjusted to that different focus. I do think there was a lot of potential. I do think there was a lot of overlap, as Mike noted. And I do think it will inform Jill's work as she works across boards and commissions. So I think it's a good thing. I also appreciate Jill adding to my understanding of why it was hosted by the Public Health Advisory Board. So I like Mike's idea. If this develops much more, we may want to formally name one or more representatives to that group for those discussions. We'll see what comes of it.
Anything else on this agenda item? Okay, we are at the items for the next task force agenda. So Jill, what do you have so far?
So far, I have Doug's ride-along program presentation and committee updates.
That's it, huh?
Yeah, and if Eric Ritchie pops up with his recommendations, we can put that on the agenda as well.
Maybe if we could contact him and see if he's going to be available to do that.
Sure, I can email him again.
Yeah. Raylene?
Just questioning on the Eric Ritchie's presentation. I believe he met with Doug and Maya again one more time. Doug, do you have any input on that?
I just had a follow-up conversation with Eric about, and I think he was going to craft some recommendations just about things that need to be clarified in the next legislative session so that we can have a little more clarity when it comes to what is allowed, especially when it comes to Involuntary Treatment Act and the conflicting laws and kind of the gray area that puts law enforcement in and causes hesitation across all the behavioral health, mental health, law enforcement. It just needs to be fixed. And I think there's some there. And then we talked about some of the other possible recommendations when it comes to, legal standards such as probable cause versus reasonable suspicion. And I understand some of it, but unfortunately, some of that language I think has really hamstrung 99.9% of law enforcement from going out and doing what the public expects them to do. And I think I certainly understand, and Stephen's brought it up before when it comes to discretion, but reasonable suspicion is a legal standard. It's not a vague suspicion. Vague and reasonable are two completely different things.
Dan?
Yeah, I'd second what Doug just mentioned in terms of the ITA piece and what kind of unfolding that. I had a conversation with Chief Jones, who's the jail chief, a couple of weeks ago, and I had some assumptions about the jail that were not correct. I would love it if Chief Jones could come, and I don't know if it's the next meeting of the task force or maybe it's the one after, to provide some information on how the pandemic is slowing things down in terms of both jail space, but also restoration movement to Western State Hospital for the 24% of inmates that are seriously mentally ill, and how that system is really clogged up. I think the task force could benefit from some broader information as to how the jail is currently working during the pandemic.
I can certainly talk to Chief Jones about that. I know we've talked to some jurisdictions that were frustrated, and Caleb can speak to this probably better than I, but we have, the population is very challenging, and just the limitations we have with space and with COVID And quite frankly, I think Chief Jones told me last week we had 46 people currently in custody that have severe mental health issues, to the point that they can't be housed with anybody else because it creates a safety issue for other inmates. So that creates even more. We're already isolating and social distancing because of COVID, but that just limits our space even more. And trying to be, get these folks out of the facility and whether to Western State or somewhere else where they can be evaluated and they can get them the services that they need. So Caleb, anything else you want to say on that?
Yeah, it's absolutely a very complicated issue at this point, having no trials, and supposedly they're going to pick that up again, but that may be postponed depending on what's going on there. But having cases not be resolved at one end and having no ability to screen people on the other end, we're just stacking them up in jail. And then we've got seriously mentally ill people that we have no other recourse to house alone, which has further issues, damaging effects essentially on their own mental health when we keep them by themselves. And we know that this is an issue, but there isn't anything that we can do. We can't send them to Western State to get things resolved, especially if they're only held on misdemeanor offenses. And then there isn't space for them to get things resolved at Western State. And then if they go to Western State and then they return, they aren't likely to get to be seen and evaluated at the judicial level. So there's all these complicated things at play, and it just makes for a very, very terrible experience here in the jail. So, and then having on top of that COVID restrictions where we're isolating people for quarantine and then not being able to move them around for 14 days or so when they're first coming into the facility. And then we've had an outbreak at the work center, which meant that we couldn't move people to the work center for about a month and a half. And that all of that compounds to space issues that I can hardly even talk about. I could probably talk about it for 2 hours, so I'll shut up.
Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that suggestion. I think it's a really good one, Dan. I appreciate your candor. I think there's a lot of impressions or understandings or whatever we have about the jail. One thing that I think could be useful, and Chief Jones has done this in the past, is give people a little bit better sense of what they're being held on. And I think there's kind of an assumption in the community that if you have serious mental illness, you should just be discharged. But many of the people I understand have violent offenses. They have real criminal charges. And I think it's really important that we understand the complexity. And I'm sure Chief Jones will probably touch on this to some extent, but I think it will really benefit the people getting the information to get some sense that that's, yes, that is a feature of them, but they also have this accompanying other issues, right? Which makes them so complex. If it was just behavioral health and a misdemeanor, maybe we'd look at finding a way that they wouldn't have to be in jail so easily, right? So I think that's just another misunderstanding that that would be helpful if Chief Jones could kind of characterize a little bit.
Stephen.
Yeah, I especially given that we just described a very thin agenda, I'll welcome Jack's input on this, but this seems like a really important overview for the task force to have, one we haven't had for a long time. And the multiple factors that are involved in all of this would be really important for us to understand and appreciate. So if there, I don't know what it would take for Chief Jones to pull together a presentation. Ideally, some sort of materials that we could get beforehand with the packet as well would be ideal. But if she could pull that together for the next task force meeting, I think that would be ideal.
Just to confirm, that's November 9th.
No, that's November 15th.
15th, yeah.
15th for the full task force.
What do you think about that, Doug?
I think she can pull that together. I know she can talk on the subject just off the top of her head, but I understand getting a little more some statistics and just the demographic information. So fortunately we've got Caleb on here, and he's a whiz when it comes to pulling together information, and he's a wealth of knowledge himself when it comes to what's going on in our correctional facilities.
Raylene?
really important.
I think we also want to look at individuals that are not going to jail that probably need to go to jail. Frustrations from judges issuing warrants, knowing that they probably won't get booked on misdemeanor charges. Frustrations of officers and deputies out there that know that it would be beneficial to have certain people booked and knowing that they're being turned around so quickly, or that they're looking the other way because they know that they're not going to be able to get that person in custody, and a safety risk for those that aren't being incarcerated.
Dan?
Raylene kind of touched on what I was thinking. Caleb also did as well, about courts and the role that they play. I'm wondering, I see it as kind of multiple, different chunks, from law enforcement to courts to jail. I'm wondering if we can get someone from courts to talk about the just what's happening there for lack of resolution for disposition of cases, and getting people either into jail or some kind of whatever the in custody work crews, or whatever the adjudication is, to talk about from the court's perspective what is going on. So I'm wondering if maybe Whatcom Superior Court would be the right entity, some member of that jurisdiction. So I'm trying to add courts to the jail discussion for next time, is what I'm saying.
Arlene?
In regard to the jail discussion and the report from Wendy Jones, to me, one of the most important comments from her, I would think, would be to explain to us what is needed, not just what has been happening and what exists, but what we need.
Doug?
I just wanted to, just for this group's information, and certainly I'll have Chief Jones add that to her list, but all the challenges that we've described in the jail, we implemented booking restrictions last March. So even with booking restrictions, we find ourselves in a predicament with a backlog and a lot of severely mentally ill people with no other alternative in place to send them. So there's a lot of challenges, and a lot of it just comes down to the facility and then the resources that are available to assist with that. So so to Raylene's point, I was just on with the city of Ferndale, and they were frustrated. Their judges and their courts were frustrated that they couldn't get people into the jail that they thought needed to be there. And we had to explain everything that Caleb laid out about, space issues, COVID, all the mentally ill people that we have in there, and no place else to send them to for evaluation, and then the backlog that we have in the courts. So it's all kind of coming to a head, and I know it seems to be coming up more and more in conversation, and I'll just point it out now. The need for a new correctional facility has not gone away, and I think COVID has really highlighted the deficiencies in the facility, and even under booking restrictions and booking less people, we find ourselves as a community in this position. So I appreciate the fact that we've had a couple council people and even people in these committees that recognize that there's a need there, and it's not so that we can arrest more people. It's that we can address the needs of those that need to be, because they pose a risk to the public, and hopefully get the whole criminal justice system working together to get people in and out and where they should be.
Raylene?
Thank you. I just want to touch on some of the topics that Dan had brought up on bringing somebody in from the courts. I would think that maybe we could reach out to Superior Court Judge Dave Freeman, as he might be able to give us a perspective from the felony portion of it. And then possibly Angela Anderson. I know she's newly appointed right now to district court, but she was also in the municipal courts. So she might be able to bring a different perspective from both sides.
Perry?
Yes, not really a topic for items for a next task force, but it sort of continues to come up, and so wanted to offer this, that sort of tagging on to what Doug and some others had said. The health department was notified by Compass Health that they were going to discontinue the jail juvenile behavioral health treatment program. I believe it was a couple of months ago. I don't know the exact date. They've actually been the provider for the jail behavioral health program for, if I recall correctly, the last 8 years. So that was certainly of concern, and they cited workforce challenges, the inability to fill those positions, those kinds of things that we've all talked about. What we did with that was a couple of things. We put out an RFQ and responded, got a number of responses. The end result of that and the review of that, which included Ms. Jones from the jail, was that Lifeline Connections would step up and is willing to be a provider. Right now, they're going through negotiations just in terms of the model of the services being provided, the staff, et cetera. So it wasn't going anywhere with that other than to be able to respond to, yep, we're certainly aware of it. And to add to that perfect storm, this dynamic is occurring, but have high hopes. And I'll add one last piece that absolutely in the discussions made the priority the reentry position, along with obviously those mental health professionals that respond to the kites and the needs, suicide assessments and those kinds of things within the jail. So that's been confirmed, and we're in the negotiation process at this point. And there's also some bridge work that is just being discussed in between when Lifeline Connections will, be able to step in, and also services that are needed now. So just wanted to update folks in that regard. Wasn't sure exactly where to jump in and do that.
Thanks, Perry. Any other items for our next agenda for the full task force? Jill, you got did you get marching orders out of that?
I sure did. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, we will move to public comment. Is there anyone wishing to provide public comment today?
Well, we don't have anyone attending, so no public comments.
Okay.
Perry, I had just a few things for good of the order type of comment.
Sure, go ahead, Mike.
Just to update the steering committee, because you all have been made aware, but with Stephen Gockley, we've been meeting with some providers looking at targeting some housing resources to grace and lead participants. We have been making some progress in that and have secured some spots with Pioneer Human Services in their Citygate apartments. And we're going to work with them and see if that program can possibly be expanded. The other good of the order comment is just to let you know, because it really was born in this task force. So you all should know that the recovery house, where the keys were officially handed to Lifeline Connections, the same provider that Perry just mentioned, will be operating a low intensity residential treatment for men coming from drug court. That is going to be their first priority. And they, of course, would be able to serve other folks too, once that need has been met. So there are some positive things afoot in the community, and certainly seeing some new things come on, I think is just good to keep in mind. And also just a nod to the power of this committee and the ideas that are born from here. This is before my involvement in this committee, right? And how long it takes to make something like that happen. They're already talking about how can we make a similar facility for people identified as women. So, I think it's really important, and y'all's input and steering and recommendations are powerful, and they can take sometimes a very long time to come to fruition. But I just want to compliment the members of this task force and the members of the original task force for highlighting some of the needs in this community. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. That's good. That's good to hear. Jill?
Yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know that Executive to-do's recommendations for mid-biennium budget adjustments include $50,000 to fund the task force communications consultants. So that's good news on that front. And I will be rescheduling on the committee agendas for both behavioral health and legal and justice, the request to identify the key messages for a consultant. So I just wanted to remind everyone of that as well.
Thank you. Arlene?
I feel really optimistic because this is a time to celebrate the fact that funding is coming down from many sources. And I'm saying this from the perspective of the North Sound Behavioral Health Organization. It's like, I don't know, the faucets are opening in a way that hasn't happened in a really long time. So let's be glad about that.
Raylene?
Real quick, unrelated to this committee, I want to talk to Dan at the end of it, if he has a moment.
Anything else? Anything else for the good of the order?
If I can get Jack and Stephen to stay behind as well, that would be great. Thank you.
All right, folks, have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next time. We're adjourned.